Nobody wants to have this conversation. Let's have it anyway. Why it is so hard to be a man. Let me say something out loud that apparently requires enormous courage in 2026. Being a man is hard. Not harder than being a woman. Not a competition. Not a grievance lecture. But hard, measurably, statistically, provably, quietly, devastatingly hard. And the moment anyone tries to say so publicly, something remarkable happens. The conversation gets killed before it starts. People reach for the smelling salts. Someone screams, "Privilege!" so fast they pull a muscle doing it. Then the screenings get canceled. Then the filmmaker gets called a misogynist. Then the psychologist gets called dangerous. Then the journalist who lived it for 18 months checks herself into a psychiatric facility and the world moves on. I am a science teacher. I teach evidence. So here's the evidence. And I will warn you up front. The sources I am about to use will make it very difficult to dismiss this as a right-wing talking point. A lesbian, feminist journalist. A feminist documentary filmmaker who started out trying to expose the men's rights movement. Cross-national empirical data from Scandinavia, the most gender-equal societies in the history of human civilization. And a clinical psychologist who traveled to Oslo, Helsinki, Stockholm, and Copenhagen, specifically to look at what those societies produced when women and men were finally free to choose. If you're inclined to say this is just MAGA nonsense, the door is behind you and I wish you well. Everyone else, let's go. Part 1. The Feminist Who Went Undercover. Nora Vincent spent 18 months living as a man she called Ned. Not transgender, not questioning her identity. A self-described lesbian feminist journalist who wanted to investigate male spaces, bowling leagues, strip clubs, men's therapy groups, monasteries, high-pressure sales floors, and expected to find what she had always assumed was there. Arrogance, dominance, casual contempt for women, and the comfortable sprawl of privilege. She went in loaded for bear. She came out permanently changed. She joined a blue-collar bowling league. She attended a men's therapy group. She visited a monastery. She went on 30 dates as a man. She worked a high-pressure sales job. She went to strip clubs with men. What she found in those spaces was not what she expected. She found men who were profoundly lonely. Not alone, surrounded by people, sometimes surrounded by genuine friends, but lonely in a way that had no language and no permitted outlet. She watched them communicate through banter and practical help, and a handshake that meant everything they would never say with words. She described her first real male handshake as feeling like a rush, an instant inclusion in a camaraderie that felt very old and practiced. She called it a solidarity of sex, and observed that men had figured something out about brotherhood that feminism spent decades trying to teach, and never quite got to. And beneath that camaraderie, she found something she had not prepared for. Pain. Enormous, suppressed, systematically untreated pain. Vincent wrote about the moment in a boy's life when the sweetness is pounded out of him, when tenderness becomes liability, when the ability to show what he feels gets trained out of him, not by a mustache-twirling villain, but by 1,000 small corrections delivered by people who genuinely loved him and were passing on the only survival guide they had ever received. Stop crying! Man up. Toughen up. Repeated until anger became the only emotion with a socially acceptable exit route. She saw the result most clearly in the men's therapy group. Men who had carried unprocessed grief and fear and loneliness for decades, finally reaching a pressure valve. And what came out was rage. Not because they were violent people, because rage was the only thing the script allowed. Every other feeling had been disqualified. Dating as Ned broke something in her. She called it the hardest thing she had to do. She felt total social defenselessness, initiating, risking, performing confidence she did not feel, absorbing rejection delivered with the casualness of someone swatting a fly. She came away with a reaction she did not expect and was honest enough to name. A momentary flash of resentment. Not hatred of women, just what builds when you put yourself out there and get nothing back and realize nobody is going to acknowledge how hard that was. Then she admitted she had treated men exactly that way before the experiment. That kind of honesty is rare. Worth paying attention to. Every man's armor is borrowed and 10 sizes too big, and beneath it, he's naked and insecure and hoping you won't see. Nora Vincent, self-made man. The project ended with a breakdown severe enough to land her in a psychiatric facility. She described the cognitive dissonance of performing male emotional suppression, suppressing her own natural responses to maintain the persona of Ned as untenable. And she was doing it as a professional experiment, with a clear end date and a book deal waiting. Men do it for a lifetime, without the book deal. She closed her account of manhood with this: men haven't had their movement yet, not really, not intimately, and they're due for it. She died in 2022. Treatment-resistant depression, medically assisted death in Switzerland. She endured everything she documented, and still spent her remaining years insisting that male pain deserved to be seen. I find her more credible on this subject than most commentators who have never actually sat with it. Part 2. The filmmaker who went in to expose them. Cassie J was a feminist filmmaker. She will tell you that herself, past tense, is her own choice, not mine. In 2016, she released a documentary called The Red Pill, which chronicled her year-long investigation into the men's rights movement, an organization she assumed, like most people, was a misogynistic hate group primarily concerned with rolling back women's progress. She went in to expose them. She had the framing. She had the funding, until the funding dried up the moment people found out what she was actually making. So she crowdfunded it, raising over $211,000 from people who wanted the conversation to happen. What she found instead of an easy expose was something considerably more complicated. Men's rights advocates. Whatever their organizational flaws, and Jay was not blind to those, were raising issues that were real, documented, measurable, and almost entirely ignored by mainstream discourse. Male suicide rates of roughly 75 to 80% of all suicides in Western countries. Men dominating the most dangerous occupations: mining, logging, construction, fishing, and dying there at rates that would generate congressional hearings if the demographic were different. Family court disparities that routinely disadvantaged fathers. Male victims of domestic violence who had essentially nowhere to go, in part because the woman who founded the first modern domestic violence shelter, Erin Pitsey, had spent decades being called anti-feminist for pointing out that some of those victims were men. Boys falling behind in educational achievement, and college enrollment at rates that would produce emergency task forces if the numbers were reversed. These are not fringe allegations. They are documented patterns. And Jay's film asked a simple question: why are we not talking about this? Then the protests came. Then the screenings were cancelled. A cinema in Melbourne, Australia dropped the film after a petition circulated. Similar things happened in Canada. The documentary, asking for empathy toward men, was treated as a threat to women. Sit with that. A film that said, "Are men suffering too, and are we paying attention?" was protested and suppressed. Not because it was factually wrong, but because it was inconvenient. Quinn's Law number 1. Liberalism always generates the exact opposite of its stated intent. A movement that claims to want empathy and inclusion for all people actively worked to prevent a conversation about half of all people. Jay did not emerge as a convert to any political faction. She emerged as someone who could no longer reduce gender to a simple oppressor-victim binary. That is, apparently, a radical position in 2026. Part 3. The data they do not want to discuss. Science teacher mode. Stay with me. American men die by suicide at roughly 4 times the rate of women. Not slightly elevated, not a modest gap. 4 times. Men account for approximately 79 to 80% of all suicide deaths in this country, while comprising half the population. Read that again. The gap is widest in the demographic that receives the least cultural sympathy. Men in their 50s and 60s, after job loss or divorce or the loss of the identity that came from being the provider and protector. Men who were told their entire lives that their value was what they produced and protected. Men who, when they could no longer produce or protect, had no other framework for what they were worth. Men live approximately 5 to 6 years less than women on average. They dominate 13 of the 15 leading causes of death. They represent the majority of the homeless population, with higher rates of being unsheltered, sleeping outside, not in shelters, than women in comparable circumstances. They are overrepresented in every dangerous occupation, and when they reach a breaking point, they are measurably less likely to seek help. Not because they are too dense to recognize suffering, because they have been trained from childhood to interpret needing help as failure. The man box. That is what researchers call it. The invisible rule set. Be strong, do not cry, do not ask for help, do not need things, do not burden others. Perform confidence you do not feel, hold up the world without complaining, and do all of it silently. Violate any rule, and the social consequences arrive quickly and without mercy. Boys learn these rules early, from fathers who learn them from their fathers, from coaches and peers, and a culture that praises stoicism in men the same way it praises tenderness in women and punishes the reverse. Nobody hosts a benefit concert for male suicide. It does not trend. The conversation gets buried every single time it gets started. Part 4. The Kathy Newman moment and what it actually showed. I want to spend some time here, because this matters. In 2018, Jordan Peterson sat down for an interview with Kathy Newman of Channel 4 News in the UK. Newman went in with an agenda, which is fine, journalists do that, and spent roughly 30 minutes trying to catch Peterson in a contradiction or expose him as anti-woman. The interview became one of the most watched political exchanges of the decade. Nearly 40 million people have seen it. What actually happened is worth understanding if you want to discuss this topic honestly. Newman kept setting traps, so what you're saying is women should just accept less money? So what you're saying is women can't make it to the top? So what you're saying is women are too agreeable to get ahead? And Peterson kept calmly saying, no, that is not what I'm saying. Every single time. The moment that stopped the whole interview cold was when Newman pushed him on free speech. Why should your right to free speech trump a transgender person's right not to be offended? And Peterson responded, well, because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. And then he turned it around, noted that Newman herself was asking tough questions and risking offense in the pursuit of truth, and that he thought that was exactly right. Newman paused, long pause, then said, "Ha! Gotcha!" Except she hadn't, and she knew it. And 40 million people watched the moment she knew it. What struck me watching that interview was not the debate about gender. It was the demonstration of Peterson's central point, which is that you have to be willing to say things that make people uncomfortable in order to get to the truth. Newman was trying to make Peterson uncomfortable. He sat there and refused to budge, not because he was arrogant, because he actually knew what he believed and why. Piers Morgan later sat down with Peterson and said something that I think deserves to be repeated. I don't see the devil that some people try and portray you as at all. His diagnosis of Peterson after an hour of genuine conversation: you're probably optimally disagreeable for your profession, which is not an insult. In psychology, disagreeableness predicts willingness to say difficult things accurately and stand behind them. It is, in fact, a necessary trait for the kind of work Peterson does. Is Peterson right about everything? No. Does he overstate biology at times? Probably. Is some of his rhetoric sharper than necessary? He himself has said so. He sat for an hour-long video called Mean Tweets, where his friends grilled him on exactly that, and came out saying he would try to deliver the same accurate content in a calmer tone. But the data he cites on gender differences? That is mainstream psychology. That is 30+ years of Big Five personality research. That is the same data that left-leaning academics and left-leaning universities produced and then were baffled by because it did not confirm their assumptions. Part 5. The paradox. The data actually shows. Jordan Peterson traveled to Oslo, Helsinki, Stockholm, and Copenhagen in late 2018. He gave lectures, he met with researchers, and in December of that year, he published an essay called The Gender Scandal, Part 1, Scandinavia, which laid out what he had been saying in lectures in written form. The core of it: Scandinavia is a natural experiment. The Nordic countries have done more than any other societies on Earth to create gender equality through progressive policy. Extensive parental leave, subsidized childcare, anti-discrimination laws with real enforcement, decades of cultural emphasis on equal participation. By every major index, the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index. These are the most gender-equal societies in human history. If the social constructionist theory of gender is correct, the theory that says men and women behave differently, primarily because of socialization, cultural norms, and structural barriers, then Scandinavia should have nearly erased those differences by now. Remove the barriers, and people sort into roles and careers more or less identically. The data shows the opposite. In Scandinavia, women disproportionately choose people-oriented fields: nursing, psychology, education, social work, counseling. Men disproportionately choose thing-oriented fields: engineering, computer science, physics, mechanics, construction. Occupational segregation, the degree to which men and women work in different fields, is in many measures greater in the Nordic countries than in less egalitarian societies. A 2018 study in psychological science by Stote and Geary analyzed PISA data and UNESCO statistics across dozens of countries. Their finding: the percentage of women among STEM graduates was negatively correlated with national gender equality scores. The more gender equal the country, the fewer women in STEM. Not slightly fewer. The relationship was robust enough that researchers named it the gender equality paradox. Peterson's explanation is straightforward and supported by Big Five personality research. When you remove economic necessity from the career decision, when basic survival is not at stake, when the welfare state is robust enough that any career can sustain a decent life, people choose based on intrinsic interest rather than pragmatic necessity. And, on average, across populations, men and women show measurable differences in those interests. Women show stronger average preferences for people-oriented work. Men show stronger average preferences for thing-oriented work. These are averages. The individual overlap is enormous. Many women are brilliant engineers and many men are outstanding nurses, and nobody should be discouraged from any field. But the averages are real, statistically robust, and amplified by freedom, not produced by oppression. As societies become more gender equal in their social and political policies, men and women become more different in certain aspects, rather than more similar. Jordan Peterson, The Gender Scandal, 2018. Peterson is also careful in a way his critics rarely acknowledge. He states directly in the essay, men and women are more similar than they are different. This is true cross-culturally. Even when men and women are most different, in those cultures where they differ most, they are more similar than different. The but follows quickly. The differences matter, particularly at the extremes, particularly with regard to occupational choice. The extremes are where most policy debates are actually happening. The people who end up as CEO of a Fortune 500 company, or as a construction worker who dies on the job, or as a nursing home aide at 3 a.m., they are not representative of the whole distribution. And at those tails, average differences in personality, interest, and willingness to make certain trade-offs compound into outcomes that look dramatic from the outside. Peterson also reframes the glass ceiling question in a way that is worth sitting with honestly. He asks, why are there any men who want those top positions at all? Because getting to the top of a large organization is an extraordinarily brutal enterprise. It requires 70 to 80 or more hour work weeks, sustained ruthless competition, enormous personal sacrifice, and a personality profile that most human beings, men and women alike, sensibly find repellent at its extreme. The men who pursue and achieve those positions are outliers among men. They are not representative of men in general. They tend to score very high on assertiveness, very low on agreeableness, and very high on willingness to treat other people as obstacles in a competition. Women, on average, score higher on agreeableness, meaning stronger orientation toward compassion, cooperation, and social harmony. This is not a weakness. In most of human life, it is an advantage, but it correlates with lower interest in purely competitive hierarchies, and with different trade-off calculations around family, work hours, and career sacrifices. This is not an argument against women in leadership. It is an argument against the assumption that a 50-50 distribution in every field at every level is the natural resting state of human beings freed from all barriers, because the Nordic data suggests it is not. In fact, it suggests the opposite. Peterson's policy implication is clear. If your goal is 50-50 representation in every field through enforcement, you are potentially imposing your preferred outcome on people who have freely chosen something different. That is not equality. That is coercion wearing equality's clothing. The Swedish foreign minister told him to go climb back under the rock he came from when he described this research in Stockholm. He pointed out that she should be held accountable for that. It was a flippant dismissal of mainstream peer-reviewed psychology from a position of power, and it deserved a specific rebuttal, not a personal insult. She did not provide one. Part 6. The lobster, the serotonin, and why it matters. I want to address something that gets mocked relentlessly without being understood. The lobster. Peterson's first rule in 12 Rules for Life is stand up straight with your shoulders back. He illustrates it with lobsters, not because lobsters are a perfect metaphor for human beings, but because lobsters share with us a neurological feature that is 350 million years old. They have a nervous system that tracks hierarchical status and runs on serotonin. When lobsters win, serotonin levels rise. When they lose, they drop. Their posture changes accordingly. Our nervous systems work similarly. The part of your brain that registers social status and affects your mood, your posture, and your sense of efficacy runs on the same basic chemistry. This is not controversial neuroscience. It has been known for 30 years. Antidepressants work on lobsters because the relevant pathways are that conserved. Peterson's point is simple and devastating to a particular ideological narrative. Hierarchical organization is not a social construct invented by the Western patriarchy to oppress people. It is a feature of animal social organization that predates trees. You cannot eliminate it without eliminating something so deep in the architecture of social animals that you would be rebuilding the species from scratch. Does that mean current hierarchies are perfectly fair or optimal? No. Does it mean we should not work to improve access and reduce arbitrary discrimination? No. It means that the premise, that hierarchy itself is artificial, that any observed disparity is necessarily the product of oppression, that the natural resting state of liberated human beings is perfect equality of outcome, is not just wrong, but provably, measurably, 350 million years of evolutionary history wrong. The question is not whether hierarchies exist. They do, and they will. The question is how to structure them so they reward competence rather than corruption, and so that access to them is as fair as possible. That is a very different conversation than demanding they produce perfectly equal outcomes by demographic. Part 7. What this actually means for young men. I am a science teacher. I watch young men navigate a world that issues contradictory instructions without a manual. Be strong, but not dominant. Lead, but do not control. Express feelings, but do not be too much. Pursue connection, but do not be creepy. Provide for your family, but do not define yourself by your career. Take up space, but not too much space. All of it issued simultaneously. All of it with swift social punishment for getting the balance wrong. Peterson made an observation on the Piers Morgan show that I think is worth sitting with. He said young men are literally dying for a message of encouragement. Not coddling, not validation of bad behavior. Just someone saying, you have something to offer. Growing up is not a cage. It is a destination. The struggle to take on responsibility and become someone worth being is where you find the meaning that sustains you through difficult times. He described watching thousands of people come to his talks, and nearly all of them saying the same thing. They had been in a dark place. They had started trying to adopt personal responsibility and a vision for the future, and things were measurably better. And he got emotional on camera, genuinely emotional, talking about how many people are dying for a lack of an encouraging word. That is not dangerous. That is not misogynistic. That is a clinical psychologist who has spent decades sitting across from people in genuine pain and knows what they need to hear. The culture that surrounded Peterson's rise told young men that masculinity is toxic, that hierarchy is oppression, that any disproportionate male presence in any field is evidence of prejudice, that ambition and competition are inherently suspect. It told them to take up less space, to apologize for their history, to be less. And then we express shock at the suicide numbers. Quinn's Law number 2. The road to liberal hell is paved with good intentions. The messaging was well-intentioned. The damage is real and measurable, Peterson told Newman in their interview. Women want, deeply want, men who are competent and powerful. And I do not mean power in the sense of tyrannical control over others. That is not power. That is corruption. Power is competence. Why would you not want a competent partner? That is not a controversial statement. It is barely even arguable, and it got him labeled as a reactionary. Part 8. The closing question. I am going to ask you the same question I asked earlier, but I want you to sit with it longer this time. If any other demographic were dying by suicide at 4 times the baseline rate, and had been for decades, and we knew about it, and we had researchers documenting it and filmmakers documenting it, and journalists living it for 18 months and writing books about it, and the cultural response was to cancel the screenings, call the researchers dangerous, and tell the journalists who produced the data to go climb back under their rocks. What would we call that? I know what I would call it. I would call it a failure. A quiet, ongoing, entirely preventable failure that we have collectively decided is acceptable because the people doing the dying were not the right demographic for us to care about loudly. The men quietly drowning at the bowling alley, in the truck on the way home, in the garage at 2 a.m. They are not abstractions. They are fathers and sons and brothers and veterans and teachers and truck drivers and construction workers and students who aged out of a system that had no framework for their pain. Real people, real suffering, a real failure on our part. Nora Vincent saw it in 18 months and it cost her a psychiatric hospitalization to process. Cassie J documented it across a year of filmmaking and had her screenings canceled for it. Jordan Peterson has cited cross-national empirical data about it for nearly a decade and been called dangerous. The Scandinavian data has been reproducible for years, and the response has largely been to find methodological objections. I am a science teacher. I follow evidence where it leads, regardless of whether the destination is comfortable. And the evidence leads here. Men are struggling in ways our culture has decided, for reasons I cannot justify with any data I have ever seen, are either unimportant or someone else's fault. They deserve better. They deserve the conversation. And they deserve people willing to have it without flinching. So, what do you think? Leave a reply. Serious question. But what do I know? I am only a science teacher, and Army combat medic who spent enough years watching men carry things they were never taught to put down to know that silence is not the same thing as healing, and that what we are doing right now is not working.